Hello, weary travelers. I am Adam Reason, your voice in the void, guiding you beyond the threshold into the strange sanctuary of Psycho Adam Reads, a place where reality fractures, darkness whispers, and nightmares reign eternal. If an unsettling story haunts your thoughts, share it in the comments below. Subscribe to join our Twilight Assembly. Ignite the like button to fend off lurking horrors. And ring the notification bell, lest the shadows catch you unaware. Once a week, we venture forth, a deeply immersive terror every Monday at 8 p.m. Now, lower your guard, surrender your disbelief, and step boldly into Psycho Adam Reads. I've worked in Grandpa's shop most of my life. It was the first job for not just me, but all my siblings and most of my cousins. Grandpa runs a little pawn shop downtown, the kind of place that sells antiques as well as modern stuff. He does pretty well. I don't think I've ever seen him worry about paying rent. He can afford to pay us kids better than any other place in the neighborhood. All the other kids quit after a while, but I enjoyed the work, and Grandpa always said I had a real knack for it. "Keep it up, kid," he'd say. "Someday, this old shop will be yours." Grandpa and I live above the shop. He offered me the spare room after Grandma died a few years back. It's been a good arrangement. Every evening, he turns on the radio, cracks a beer, and we sit around drinking. He tells me stories from back in the day. The radio never seems to make any noise, though. I always asked him why he kept it around. He told me it was something he'd had for a long time, and that it was special. When I asked how the old radio was special, he said it was a long story. I told him I didn't have anything else to do but sit here, listen to the rain, and hear him out. And so, he talked about the radio. Grandpa grew up in the early 60s. Technically, he was born in the 40s and raised in the 50s. But in a lot of stories, it doesn't really seem like his life began until 1962. He describes it as one of the most interesting times of his life, and a lot of it is because of his father, my great-grandpa. He grew up in Chicago, and the town was just starting to get its feet under it after years of war and strife. His mother died when he was 14, and his father opened a pawn shop with the money from her life insurance policy. They weren't called pawn shops back then. Grandpa said his great-grandfather ran a brokerage or something. But all that mattered was that people came in and tried to sell strange and wondrous things. Great-grandpa ran the place with his family. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-uncle Terry. Great-great-grandma lived with them, but she didn't help out in the shop much. She had dementia, so she mostly stayed upstairs in her room, knitting and waiting to die. They lived above the shop in a little 3-bedroom flat. It was tight, Grandpa said, but they did all right. Grandpa worked at the pawn shop when he needed money to pay for his own apartment. He said they got some of the strangest things sometimes, especially because Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was an odd duck, and that's coming from a family that wasn't exactly normal. Dad usually bought things he knew he could sell easily. Tools, cars, furniture, that sort of thing. Uncle Terry, however, would often buy things that were harder to move. He once bought a bunch of old movie props from a guy who claimed they were genuine from a Bela Lugosi film. Dad lost his mind over that one. Uncle Terry was also the one who bought jewelry that turned out to be stolen. That was okay, though, since they turned it over to the police, and the reward was worth way more than they'd spent on it. Terry was like a metronome. He'd make the worst choices and then the best choices, sometimes both at once. So, of course, Terry was the one who bought the radio. Dad had been sick for about a week, bad enough that the family worried he might not pull through. Back then, people didn't always get over illnesses unless they had money to see a doctor. You either got better or you didn't. Dad finally hacked it all up and recovered. He was ready to return to work. So he comes downstairs to the shop floor, where Terry's been sitting there reading some artsy-fartsy magazine. Dad looks over and sees they've taken in a new radio. A big old German model with a dark wood cabinet and dials that looked like they belonged in Frankenstein's lab. He thinks it looks pretty good and congratulates Terry, saying everybody wants a good radio and it'll be easy to sell. Terry looks up from his magazine and says it ain't a radio. Dad asks him what the hell it is. Terry puts down the magazine and gives him the creepiest grin you've ever seen. It's a spirit radio, Terry announces, like that's supposed to mean something. Now, I was working when Dad and Uncle Terry had that conversation. Dad just pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head, like he was trying not to bash Terry's skull in. After buying a bunch of counterfeit movie props that Dad didn't even need an expert to tell were fake, Uncle Terry had been put on a strict $100 a month budget for things he could buy for the shop. Anything over $100 he had to talk to Dad about. Dad hadn't had any visits from Uncle Terry other than to bring him food in the last week, so he knew it either cost less than $100 or Terry had ignored the budget. Dad asked, "How much did this thing cost, Terry?" His voice was sharp, already angry. Terry seemed to hedge a little, saying, "Don't worry, it'll pay for itself. By the end of the month, you'll see." Dad pressed him. "How much?" His tone made it sound like a threat. $500, Terry admitted. "But look, I've already made back 200 of that. Give me another week and I'll..." Dad had heard enough. "You spent $500 on this thing? It had better be gold-plated, because $500 is a lot of money for a damn radio." Terry tried to explain, but Dad wouldn't hear it. He told Terry to get out of the shop for a while, or he'd probably commit fratricide. Terry suddenly remembered a friend he had to see and made himself scarce. Then Dad honed in on me like I had something to do with it. He asked how much Terry really spent on it. I told him Terry actually spent about $550. Dad asked why in heaven's name nobody consulted him before spending such an astronomical sum. The truth was, I was a little spooked by the radio. The guy had brought it in on a rainy afternoon on a dolly covered by an old blanket. When he wheeled it up to the counter, I came to see what he'd brought. Terry was already there, reading, doing a lot of nothing, and he perked up when the old guy told him he had something miraculous to show him. I didn't care much for the old guy myself. He sounded foreign, German maybe, and his glass eye wasn't fooling anybody. He whipped the quilt off the cabinet like a showman doing a trick, and there was this spirit radio, humming placidly before the front desk. Uncle Terry asked him what it was. The man said he'd be happy to demonstrate. He took out a pocket knife, cut his finger, and sprinkled the blood into a bowl of crystals on top of it. As the blood fell on the rocks, the dials began to glow, and the thing hummed to life. Uncle Terry started to tell the man he didn't need to do that, but as it glowed and crooned, his protests died on his lips. "Spirit radio," the man said. "Who will win tomorrow's baseball game?" In a deep, unsettling voice, the radio replied, "The Phillies. They'll defeat the Cubs 9-7. Uncle Terry looked ready to faint on the spot. When he asked the man what he wanted for it, he balked a little at the price. They haggled back and forth for nearly an hour until they finally settled on $5.50. I could see Dad getting mad again, so I told him the rest of it too. Terry isn't wrong, though. He's been using that spirit radio to place bets on different stuff. The Phillies actually did win the game the next day, 9-7, and he's been making bets and collecting debts ever since. He's paid the store back $200, but he's won more than that. Dad looked mad still, but he looked intrigued as well. He didn't put a lot of stock in such weirdness, but he understood money. I saw him look at the spirit radio with the bowl of crystals on top. Then he dug out his old buck knife. I turned away before I could see him slice himself. He grunted and squeezed a few drops over the bowl. When the radio purred to life, I turned back to see it glowing, the dials softly emitting light through foggy glass. It always made me shiver. To this day, I think those were the spirits or ghosts of those who had used it, but who knows? Dad hesitated, maybe sensing what I had sensed too. When he spoke, his voice quavered for the first time I could remember. Who will win the first race at the dog track tomorrow? The radio softly hummed, contemplated, and finally whispered, Mama's boy will win the first race of the day at Olson Park track tomorrow. Dad rubbed his face, the scrub of stubble loud against his palm. He thought about it, then went to the register to see what we'd made while he was gone. When Uncle Terry came back, Dad handed him an envelope and told him to shut up when he tried to explain himself. You'll be at Olson Park track tomorrow for the first race. You'll take the money in this envelope, bet every cent of it on Mama's boy to win, and bring me all the winnings back. If you lose that money, I'll put this thing in the window, sell it as a regular radio, and you'll never be allowed to purchase anything for the shop again. Terry asked, and if he wins? Dad didn't answer. Grandpa took a sip of his beer then, getting a faraway look as he contemplated. That was just how Grandpa told stories. He always looked like he was living in the times he was talking about. In a lot of ways, he was going back to the 1960s, the most interesting time of his young life, to a time when he encountered something he couldn't quite explain. Did he win? I asked, invested now in the story, as we sat in the apartment above the shop, drinking beer and watching the rain. Oh yeah, Grandpa said. He won. Now, we'll return to our story in just a moment. But first, my wanderers, a brief interlude. If this journey speaks to your soul, subscribe to ensure your safe return passage. Strike the like button to mark your presence in the darkness. And activate the notification bell so you're always prepared when Psycho Adam Reads beckons again. Now, take a breath, steady your nerves, and let's delve deeper still into Psycho Adam Reads. Sometimes he could get a play-by-play if he bled enough for it. Dad used it sparingly, still not liking to give it blood. Uncle Terry was adamant about it, though. It was in him. Even though it hurt him a lot, he kept on using it. He could always be seen hanging around the radio, talking to it, feeding it. Dad didn't like the method, but he liked the money it brought in. The shop was doing better than ever, thanks to the cash from the spirit radio. Dad was buying better things to stock the store with. Cars and luxury electronics. There was always a net gain. Once they saw times were good, everyone was doing well. That's when Uncle Terry took it a little too far. Grandpa brought the bottle to his mouth but stopped halfway, the contents spilling on his undershirt as he watched the rain. He jumped when the cold liquid touched him. righted the bottle, and put it down, laughing at himself. He shook the drops off his shirt and looked back at the rain, running his tongue over his dry lips. "One night, we tied on a few too many," he said. Uncle Terry got this really serious look on his face. He staggered downstairs, despite Dad yelling at him, asking where he was going. When we heard him yelling, we ran downstairs to see what was going on. He was leaning over the spirit radio, tipping blood from his finger, dribbling it into the crystal dish on top. As it came to life, he put his ruddy face close to the wooden cabinet and bellowed his question clearly not for the first time. "When will I die?" The radio was silent, lights blinking, but it didn't answer. He cut another finger, asking the same question, but it still didn't respond. We couldn't stop him. He slit his palm almost to the wrist. As the blood dribbled into the stones, he nearly screamed, "When will I die?" The spirit radio said nothing. Dad and I had to restrain him before he could do it again. "We don't know what brought this on," Grandpa continued. "We never found out, but Uncle Terry became obsessed with death, more specifically, his own. Maybe all this spirit talk got him thinking. Maybe he was afraid that one day his voice would come out of that radio. Whatever the case, Dad put a stop to using it. He hid the thing, but he had to keep moving it because Uncle Terry always found it. He'd hide it for a week or two, but eventually we'd find him bleeding from his palms, pressing his face against it. Sometimes I could hear him whispering to it, like it was talking back. Those times were creepy. Uncle Terry was attached to it at the hip. It went on for about 3 months, and then Uncle Terry did something unforgivable. He got his answer. Grandpa watched the rain for a moment longer, his teeth chattering a little, like he was trying to shake the sound out of his head. He didn't much care for the rain. I'd known him to close the shop if it got really bad, and it always seemed to make him uneasy. That's why we were sitting up here in the first place. "I got a call about something big," he said. "Something Dad always wanted. An antique armoire from the Civil War era. The guy was selling it dirt cheap, asking way less than it was worth. Dad wanted me to come along and help move it. He didn't think Terry would be any use, since he'd been so flaky lately, obsessed with that damn radio. He wouldn't even leave the house." To say Terry had been flaky was an understatement. Uncle Terry had been downright weird. He never left the shop, just kept looking for the radio. I started to notice a strange smell around the house. I suspected he wasn't bathing. I never saw him eat or sleep, just hunting for the radio, feeding it his blood when he found it. Dad had asked him to keep an eye on Mother, my great-grandmother, who'd been suffering from dementia for years. Dad and Uncle Terry had decided to care for her themselves instead of putting her in a home. Terry agreed. As we left the house, the rain started to come down. "That's what I always remember about that day," Grandpa said. "The rain came down in buckets, like the sky was crying for what was about to happen." We got the armoire onto the trailer. The guy had covered it with a thick old quilt to keep it from getting wet. When we got back to the shop, we brought it in and left it in the back room. Dad was smiling, knowing he had something special. He was excited to see what he could get for it. We both squished as we went upstairs to change into dry clothes, joking about the trip, until we got to the landing. Dad put out his hand, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed. I could smell it too, though I couldn't identify it at the time. Dad must have recognized it, because he burst into the apartment like a cop looking for dope. Uncle Terry was sitting in the living room, his hands red, his knees shaking, getting paler by the minute. He was rocking back and forth, the spirit radio glowing beside him, repeating the same thing over and over. "Today. It's today." He'd found it, wherever Dad had hidden it, and he'd clearly been up to his old tricks again. Dad stood over him, his fists clenched, looking like he wanted to hit him. "What have you done?" he growled. I took a step back, sensing the rage building. "Today. It's today," Terry kept repeating, rocking back and forth as he swayed. Dad turned to the bowl on top of the spirit radio. I saw it later, after everything came out. It was full of blood, the crystals practically floating in thick red liquid. Dad seemed to be doing the math. It was more blood than a finger prick or a palm cut. "Where's Mom?" Dad's voice was low and dangerous. "Today. It's today," Terry muttered. "Where's our mother?" Dad yelled, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him up. Uncle Terry had blood on his hands up to his elbows, caked on in thick, dry patches. The shaking seemed to snap him out of his haze. "It said," Terry stammered, his voice cracking. "It said if I wanted the answer, I had to sacrifice something important to know something so important. Something I loved. The others weren't enough. I didn't even know them. But Mom..." He stopped stammering when Dad wrapped his hands around his throat, choking him, shaking him violently as he screamed wordlessly into his face. When he dropped him, Uncle Terry didn't move. Dad and I stood there for a second. Dad seemed to remember that I was there at all. When he caught sight of the softly glowing radio, the object of Terry's obsession, he pivoted, lifting his foot to kick it. I could tell he meant to destroy it, to keep kicking it until it was splinters on the floor. But something stopped him. Whether it was regret for what he'd done or some otherworldly force, Dad found himself unable to touch the cabinet. Maybe he was afraid of letting the spirits out. I'll never know. This is Psycho Adam Reed's. He went to call the police so they could come and collect the bodies. They might also collect him, but he didn't talk about that as we sat in silence waiting for their arrival. Dad told the police that Uncle Terry had admitted to killing their mother, and he'd killed him in a blind rage. They went to the back room and confirmed my great-grandmother was dead. Dad didn't tell me until he was dying of cancer years later, but Terry had cut her heart out, offered it to the bowl on top of the radio, or so we assume, because we never found it in the house or in the bowl. They also discovered the bodies of 3 homeless men rotting in the back of Terry's closet. He'd bled them dry, and the smell had stained the wood in that room so badly that they had to replace it. How he'd done all that without anyone noticing, I have no idea. He must have lured them in while we were out doing other things. If it hadn't been for my great-grandmother's death being directly linked to Terry, I truly believe Dad would have been as much of a suspect. They took the bodies away, took the bowl away, and returned it later. I ended up moving in with Dad. He got kind of depressed after the whole thing, and it helped to have someone here with him. I've lived here ever since, eventually taking over the business. You pretty much know the rest. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the rain come down and the static from the old radio crackling amicably. "Have you ever used the radio?" I asked, a little afraid of the answer. Grandpa shook his head. "I saw what it did to Uncle Terry, and to a lesser degree, what it did to my dad. I've run the shop since his death, and I've done it without the radio." "Then why keep it?" I asked, looking at the old thing differently now. "Because I can't bring myself to destroy it," he said. "And I won't sell it to someone else. It could ruin their lives too. When the shop's yours, it'll be your burden. The choice of what to do with it will be up to you." I couldn't help but watch the radio, seeing it differently than I had before. As we sat drinking, I thought I could hear something under the sound of the rain. A low, melancholy moan sliding from the speakers like a whispered scream. I wondered if my great-uncle's voice was in there somewhere. Our journey ends here, for now. But remember, every shadow has secrets, and deeper mysteries await. Subscribe to remain tethered to this twilight realm. Kindle the like button, a flame held bravely against the encroaching dark. And toll the bell of notification so you're ready when Psycho Adam Reads returns next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Until then, linger at the edge of twilight. Remain ever watchful and listen closely, because sooner or later, all whispers guide you back to Psycho Adam Reads. And have a very mustache day.